Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome back to my look at the various versions of Dungeons & Dragons throughout the years. When last we left off, it was the 70s. Dungeons & Dragons had finally come together and started an entire hobby. TSR was expanding and starting to experience some growing pains. During the late 70s, Dungeons & Dragons was still spreading by word of mouth, and a great deal of its exposure relied on tournaments at hobby-specific conventions. Unfortunately, the relatively flexible nature of many of the original Dungeons & Dragons rules meant that finding enough dungeon masters that interpreted the rules in the same way, just enough to run a sizable tournament, was becoming a more and more challenging task. Thus, work had started on a version of the game which had a stricter, more robust rule set that could be used to run adventures with more consistency between the groups. That product would eventually become Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. At about this time, Dr. John Eric Holmes came into contact with TSR and ended up with the task of revising the original Dungeons & Dragons rules into a more cohesive but still rules-light system that could be used as an introductory game to prepare people who were either younger or lacked a wargaming background for the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set. It so happened that his revision was ready and published before Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This is going to be a very short look, because the Holmes edition was a very limited product. Holmes' version of the Dungeons & Dragons basic set was released in July 1977, and reprinted and repackaged in a few different variations over the coming years. It's not to be confused with the later sets by the same name, by Tom Moldvay and Frank Menser respectively. Rather, this basic set was not intended to be the start of a standalone game. Further, several other fundamental philosophical and systemic differences set it apart from later versions of the basic set released by those individuals. This basic set was compiled from the original Dungeons & Dragons, with additions from Supplement 1 Greyhawk, edited and partially rewritten to present the rules in a clear and understandable manner. It ended up being a single, under 50-page rulebook with cover art by David Sutherland III. It was also produced as a boxed set, which included the rulebook, dice, and certain supplemental materials. The boxed set was designed to be colorful and consumer-friendly, which attracted more than simply wargame-focused merchants to stock it, thus expanding its reach. Later printings included one of two sample dungeons, initially B1, In Search of the Unknown. Some of these sets included a monster and treasure assortment booklet instead, basically lists of monsters and treasures that were appropriate to a particular dungeon level. From a system standard, Holmes' basic set only allowed progress to 3rd level, with a recommendation that players wishing for a more advanced adventure get into the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game, which was released over the following few years. However, the relatively slow rate of character growth recommended in the rule set and the number of options allowed made it possible to run a game for many months with just those 3 levels available. While retaining the rules-light core from original D&D, it was presented in a more strict manner, in keeping with a desire to standardize the game going forward. While more clearly written than the original booklets, it retained many of the quirks, with combat still being based somewhat on the chainmail game, all weapons using D6s for damage, and other wargamey elements that were still held over. Again, not every ability score had adjustments, and they were presented in the same single table as they were in the prior version. Classes included thieves this time around, although mention is made of further advanced classes mentioned in the various original D&D supplements, and that they would be further elaborated on in AD&D. Character alignment uses a version of the 2-axis system that would be common in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, with a standard lawful neutral chaotic axis joined by a good neutral evil one, although in actuality, according to a strict reading of what is presented, the neutral alignment existed as its own realm, so the neutral evil or lawful neutral type combinations weren't necessarily represented. Aside from that, quite a lot of this version of the basic set is simply a rehash of original D&D with a supplementary material built in. There's a lot more magical spells, for instance, and those spells have a much more involved description. Likewise, the monster blocks are a lot more similar to what you'd see in later versions of the game, with a group of statistics above what might be a few paragraphs of description. Characters and monsters use attack matrices to determine hits or misses, but interestingly enough, there's no difference between the various character classes. All characters of level 1 to 3 use the same matrix. An initiative system based on a flat comparison of dexterity, with a d6 roll to break ties or near ties, is introduced, and appears different than basically every initiative system seen thereafter. More complex actions for combat are indicated as well, including parrying, withdrawing, etc. Treasure tables based on the classic type system are present, and the magic item list appears to be a slightly expanded version of the magic item list from original D&D. The initial booklet finishes up with a sample nameless dungeon, just to show how a DM may arrange an adventure. So I could go into the Pack-In Adventures B1 in Search of the Unknown and eventually B2 Keep on the Borderlands, but honestly, I could make an entire video just on those two alone. So how does the core version of this game itself stand? While presented in a much more readable manner than original D&D, this version of the basic set is very much a transformational step in the entire process. Later versions of the basic set, and by extension the basic rules, evolved in a slightly different direction, meaning that while the adventures are relatively compatible, it would take a little bit of adjustment to move from one version to the other. Likewise, using it as an introduction to advanced Dungeons & Dragons also has its issues. It does not look like the AD&D system had been finalized at the time, so there's some distinct differences between the way that a few systems were handled in this version of basic D&D and how they were handled in AD&D. Still, these systems are of a relatively limited scope, and a player who had played through this version likely wouldn't have too much trouble adapting to AD&D. Further, this book is significantly easier for non-wargamers to grasp than the original one, which helped with its utility. While this basic set was published in 1977, another revision was only 4 years away, which would eventually lead into the Bet Me series after just another few short years. That, however, I will address in another video. For what it was, the Holmes D&D basic set was an important evolutionary step, and yet one which today is largely overlooked, especially with regards to various OSR retro clones. It's not quite as open as the later basic versions would be, and not quite as rules-intensive as the AD&D products would end up being, thus putting it in a bit of a murky middle area. There was one fan attempt in recent years to expand the rules presented in the Holmes edition to 9th level, which, given the scope of the rules presented, no doubt posed its own challenges. You can likely find that one with a little bit of effort in searching. Sadly, with no PDF versions available or reprints available, it's difficult to experience as it was originally intended. There are a few retro clones out there, and I will put links to where you can get those in the description below where they exist. So, with the release of Holmes Basic D&D, the stage was set for the split between a basic, rules-light game for casual and new players, and a rules-heavy game suitable for tournament and long-term play. These are both versions that we will take a look at in upcoming videos. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler with my D&D Retrospective. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. If you'd like to get early access to videos like this, support the channel, and generally help shape the channel's ongoing future, consider my Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler. Until next time, take care and goodbye.